In the sprawling palaces of ancient Persia, where gold adorned every surface and silk draped from towering columns, there existed a darkness that no amount of wealth could illuminate. Behind the ornate doors of the royal harem, a systematic horror unfolded, one that would make even the cruelest battlefield seem merciful by comparison. This is not a tale of war or conquest, but of what happened when absolute power turned inward, consuming the most vulnerable members of the royal household, the king's own daughters. The Persian Empire, at its zenith under Xerxes I, stretched from India to Ethiopia, encompassing nearly half of the world's population. Yet within the heart of this magnificent empire, in the very palace that symbolized Persian power and glory, young girls born into privilege faced a fate that would haunt generations. They were not merely princesses. They were commodities in a twisted game of power, religion, and control that defied every natural law of parental protection. What you're about to hear challenges our understanding of ancient civilizations and the depths of human cruelty. The practices we will examine were not hidden aberrations, but institutionalized systems, justified by religious doctrine and political necessity. The victims had names, faces, and stories that history tried to erase. Tonight, we restore their voices to the historical record, not for sensationalism, but because their suffering demands witness and their courage deserves remembrance. The story of Xerxes and his treatment of royal women reveals a pattern of abuse so systematic, so calculated, that it became the blueprint for generations of Persian rulers. This was not the random cruelty of a mad king, but a deliberate structure of exploitation that wrapped itself in the language of divine right and state necessity. The young girls who entered the royal harem as daughters emerged, if they emerged at all, as broken instruments of their father's will. Consider for a moment the contradiction. A father, supposedly the protector of his children, becoming their greatest threat. A home meant to be a sanctuary, transformed into a prison. A birthright of royal blood becoming a curse rather than a blessing. These inversions of natural order did not happen overnight. They were cultivated, refined, and passed down through generations like a poisonous inheritance. The Persian court's treatment of women has often been romanticized in Western literature, depicted as exotic tales of harems filled with beautiful women living in luxury. But the reality, especially for royal daughters, was far from romantic. It was a world where a girl's 13th birthday marked not celebration but the beginning of systematic exploitation, where religious ceremonies masked sexual abuse, and where political marriages were preceded by years of paternal violation. To understand the full horror of what transpired in Xerxes' court, we must first understand the structure of power in ancient Persia. The king was not merely a political leader, but a semi-divine figure, the earthly representative of Ahura Mazda, the supreme deity of Zoroastrianism. This religious authority gave him rights that extended far beyond governance, rights that he claimed over the bodies and souls of everyone in his realm, including his own children. The accounts that survive come from various sources. Greek historians who viewed Persian customs with a mixture of fascination and horror, Persian court records that hint at practices too normalized to hide completely, and archaeological evidence that paints a picture of a society where the boundaries between family, property, and political tools had completely dissolved. Each source alone might be questioned, but together they form an undeniable testimony to systematic abuse. The Persian Empire of the 5th century BCE was a study in contradictions. It was simultaneously the most advanced civilization of its time and one bound by traditions that seem incomprehensible to modern sensibilities. Under Xerxes I, who ruled from 486 to 465 BCE, the empire reached both its greatest territorial extent and perhaps its moral nadir. The same king who built architectural marvels and established trade routes that connected 3 continents also presided over a court where incest was not only practiced, but institutionalized. The concept of the royal harem in ancient Persia was far more complex than popular culture suggests. It was not merely a collection of wives and concubines, but a political institution, a religious space, and a prison all at once. The women who inhabited it were classified in a strict hierarchy: the chief wife, secondary wives, concubines, and at the very bottom of this already oppressive structure, the royal daughters who had come of age. The Zoroastrian religion, which dominated Persian spiritual life, had complex views on consanguineous relationships. While later Zoroastrian texts would condemn incest, earlier interpretations, particularly those convenient to royal power, suggested that marriages within the family kept the royal blood pure. This religious justification became a shield behind which the most heinous acts could hide. Xerxes and his predecessors claimed they were following divine will when they took their daughters as concubines. The isolation of the harem created a world unto itself, with its own laws, its own economy, and its own twisted social structure. The eunuchs who guarded it were often the only male presence besides the king, creating an environment where the king's word was not just law, but the only reality the women knew. This isolation was deliberate, designed to break down resistance and normalize practices that would have caused revolution if known to the wider population. Economic factors also played a crucial role in this system of abuse. Royal daughters were valuable political currency, but their value was paradoxically increased by their father's prior claim on them. A daughter who had been sanctified through relations with the king was considered more valuable in political marriages, as she carried not just royal blood, but the king's personal seal of possession. This perverse logic turned abuse into a form of value creation. The political structure of the Persian Empire centralized power to an extent rarely seen in ancient history. Unlike the Greek city-states with their various forms of governance, or even the Roman Republic with its checks and balances, the Persian king's authority was absolute. There were no institutions capable of checking his power, no noble class strong enough to resist his will, and no religious authority independent enough to condemn his actions. The satrapy system, which divided the empire into provinces, actually reinforced central authority rather than diluting it. Satraps, or provincial governors, were often rewarded with royal daughters as wives, daughters who had already been subjected to their father's abuse. This created a web of complicity where every powerful man in the empire became implicated in the system, making resistance or reform impossible. The role of mothers in this system presents one of history's most heartbreaking paradoxes. Royal wives and concubines, themselves victims of the system, were forced to prepare their own daughters for the same fate they had endured. The historical records speak of elaborate preparation rituals, where mothers would bathe, perfume, and dress their daughters for presentation to the king, knowing full well what awaited them. The psychological torture of this forced complicity added another layer to an already incomprehensible system of abuse. The preparation of a royal daughter for her father's bed began years before the actual summons. From the moment a girl showed signs of approaching womanhood, usually around age 11 or 12, she would be moved to a special section of the harem. Here, older women who had themselves survived the system would begin her education, a euphemism for a process of psychological conditioning designed to break her will and prepare her for submission. The physical preparation was elaborate and ritualistic. The girls were subjected to beauty treatments that went far beyond normal grooming. Their bodies were repeatedly waxed, their skin bleached with dangerous chemicals, their hair treated with oils and perfumes that often caused painful reactions. Every aspect of their physical appearance was scrutinized and modified to meet the king's preferences. But this physical transformation was merely the surface of a much deeper violation. The psychological conditioning was perhaps even more damaging than the physical abuse that would follow. The girls were taught that their suffering was divinely ordained, that resistance was not just futile, but sacrilegious. They were told stories of previous daughters who had resisted and faced consequences worse than death. Stories that may have been true, given what we know of Persian punishment methods. The message was clear. Submission was the only path to survival. The actual summons, when it came, was wrapped in ceremony and religious ritual. The girl would be bathed in sacred waters, dressed in elaborate robes that symbolized her transformation from daughter to possession, and led through the palace corridors by eunuchs chanting religious hymns. To outside observers, it might have appeared as a celebration. In reality, it was a funeral for the girl's childhood, innocence, and autonomy. What happened in the king's chambers is documented only in fragments, but those fragments paint a picture of systematic, ritualized abuse. The encounters were not brief violations, but extended ordeals that could last days. The king would assert his ownership through various acts of domination, each designed to reinforce the girl's status as property rather than person. Physical violence was common, justified as necessary to break the girl's spirit and make her suitable for her future role. After the initial violation, the daughter would not return to her previous life. She would be moved to a different section of the harem, one reserved for women who had been claimed by the king. Here she would wait to be summoned again, never knowing when the next ordeal would come. Some girls were summoned frequently, others left to wonder if their abandonment was a blessing or another form of torture. The physical consequences of this abuse were severe and often permanent. Medical texts from the period, while circumspect in their language, described treating royal women for injuries consistent with violent sexual assault. Pregnancy was common, and the children born from these unions occupied a strange position in the royal hierarchy, acknowledged as royal blood, but marked by the circumstances of their conception. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of the system was how it perpetuated itself. Daughters who had been abused by their fathers were then given to nobles and satraps who continued the cycle of abuse. They were explicitly instructed that their primary value lay in producing children and serving their husbands' desires, no matter how degrading. The trauma was not just individual but generational, passed down from mother to daughter like a cursed inheritance. Among the many victims of Xerxes' depravity, the story of one girl stands out in the historical record, though her name appears in various forms across different sources. We will call her Amidas, as some Persian texts do, though this may have been a title rather than a personal name. Her story survives because it intersected with political events that Greek historians considered worth recording, providing us a window into the personal horror behind palace walls. Amidas was born around 473 BCE, making her one of Xerxes' younger daughters. Her mother was a secondary wife from Bactria, brought to the palace as part of a political alliance. From birth, Amidas occupied a precarious position, royal enough to be valuable but not significant enough to be protected. Her early childhood appears to have been relatively normal by royal standards, spent in the children's quarter of the harem with her siblings and half-siblings. The first indication of her fate appears in court records when she was 11. She was moved from the children's quarter to what was euphemistically called the preparation chamber. Her mother's reaction to this transfer is recorded in a fragment of a letter. She fell ill and remained bedridden for weeks, unable to eat or speak. The court physicians diagnosed her with maternal grief, a condition they seemed familiar with treating. For 2 years, Amidas underwent the systematic preparation described earlier, but what makes her story unique is that fragments of her own words survive, carved into the walls of her chamber and discovered by archaeologists centuries later. In Old Persian script, barely legible, she wrote prayers to Ahura Mazda, not for deliverance, but for death. "Let my breath cease before the sun sets again," one fragment reads. Another, even more heartbreaking, "Mother, why do you dress me in gold for this darkness?" At 13, Amidas was summoned to her father's chambers. The date is recorded because it coincided with a religious festival. the Feast of Mithra, when the king was supposed to embody divine purity. The irony of this timing was not lost on Greek observers, who noted it as evidence of Persian hypocrisy. What happened during that first encounter is not detailed in any surviving source, but Amydas's name appears in medical records shortly afterward, treated for injuries that required weeks of recovery. Unlike many victims who disappeared into historical silence, Amydas's story continues because she became pregnant from one of these encounters. The child she bore became a political pawn in the succession struggles after Xerxes' assassination. But more importantly for our understanding, Amydas's position as mother to a potential heir meant she had to be kept alive and relatively visible, preventing her from being disposed of like other inconvenient victims. The psychological impact of her ordeal is evident in accounts of her behavior. Greek historian Ctesias, who had access to Persian court records, describes her as a woman who spoke only when commanded and looked at no one, as if her eyes had been turned inward. She was known to stand motionless for hours, and servants reported finding her harming herself with whatever implements she could find, trying to mar the beauty that had been her curse. After Xerxes' death, Amydas faced a new horror. His son and successor, Artaxerxes I, claimed his father's women as his own, including his half-sisters. Amydas, now in her 20s, was subjected to abuse by her own brother, continuing a cycle that seemed to have no end. Her son, the product of her father's abuse, was raised to view his mother as property, completing a circle of dehumanization that defies comprehension. The abuse of royal daughters was not confined to personal gratification. It was systematically weaponized for political purposes. Xerxes understood that a daughter who had been broken by her father would be a compliant tool in political marriages, unlikely to forge independent alliances or resist her husband's will. This calculated use of trauma as a political instrument represents one of the darkest innovations of Persian statecraft. The practice of gifting daughters to military commanders and satraps served multiple purposes. First, it bound these powerful men to the king through a mixture of gratitude and complicity. Receiving a royal daughter who had been sanctified by the king's attention was presented as the highest honor, but it also made the recipient complicit in the system of abuse. They could never rebel against a king whose violations they had perpetuated. The documentation of these political marriages reveals a disturbing pattern. The daughters were often given to men who had shown signs of independence or ambition as a means of control. The presence of a traumatized, broken royal wife in their household served as a constant reminder of the king's power and reach. These women, conditioned to report everything to the palace, became unwitting spies in their husbands' homes. Military campaigns often involved the strategic deployment of royal daughters. Before major battles, Xerxes would sometimes promise specific daughters to commanders who showed exceptional valor. But these promises came with a cruel twist. The daughters would first be summoned to the king's chambers for blessing, a euphemism everyone understood but no one dared acknowledge. The commanders thus fought not for honor, but for pre-violated prizes, adding another layer of degradation to the system. International diplomacy also involved this horrific trade. When negotiating with foreign powers, Xerxes would offer daughters in marriage to seal alliances, but he would ensure these daughters carried the physical and psychological marks of his ownership, sending them as broken ambassadors of Persian power. Foreign courts often recorded their shock at the condition of these royal brides, though few dared refuse them for fear of Persian military might. The economic aspect of this system reveals another dimension of exploitation. Each daughter, prepared by the king, increased in monetary value, as measured by the bride prices demanded from recipients. The palace kept detailed records of these transactions, treating the daughters quite literally as appreciated assets. The more times a daughter was summoned to the king's chambers, the higher her eventual bride price, creating a perverse incentive for continued abuse. The intelligence value of these placed daughters cannot be overlooked. Trained from childhood to observe and report, traumatized into complete loyalty to the palace, they became a network of informants throughout the empire. Their husbands, knowing their wives' true allegiance, lived in constant paranoia. This served Xerxes' purposes perfectly, keeping his nobles and commanders off balance and unable to organize resistance. Perhaps most disturbingly, this system created a hierarchy among the victims themselves. Daughters competed for the king's favor, knowing that those who were summoned more frequently would eventually be married to more powerful men, potentially escaping the palace. This competition destroyed solidarity among the victims, preventing any collective resistance. The system was designed to turn its victims against each other, ensuring its own perpetuation. The religious framework that enabled these atrocities deserves careful examination, not to excuse the inexcusable, but to understand how systematic evil embeds itself in social structures. Zoroastrianism, as practiced in Xerxes' court, had been twisted to serve royal prerogatives. The concept of Hvaitvadatta, which originally referred to marriage within the community of believers, was reinterpreted to justify incestuous relationships within the royal family. The king's role as the earthly representative of Ahura Mazda, the supreme deity, was expanded to include rights over all aspects of his subjects' lives. Court theologians argued that just as Ahura Mazda had absolute dominion over creation, the king had absolute dominion over his realm, including the bodies of his own children. This theological framework made resistance not just treasonous, but blasphemous. Ritual purity, a central concept in Zoroastrianism, was paradoxically used to justify the most impure acts. The king's divine nature was said to purify anything he touched, transforming violation into sanctification. Young girls were told they were being blessed by the king's attention, that their suffering was a form of religious devotion. This perversion of religious concepts created a psychological prison even more secure than physical walls. The fire temples, central to Zoroastrian worship, became complicit in this system. Priests performed ceremonies that sanctified these unions, blessing the daughters before they were sent to their father's chambers. The sacred fires, meant to represent purity and truth, burned while young girls were prepared for violation. The contrast between the religion's stated values and its practical application in the royal court could not have been starker. The concept of divine bloodlines played a crucial role in justification. The royal family was believed to carry the sacred blood of the first kings, blessed by Ahura Mazda himself. Keeping this blood pure through interfamily unions was presented as a religious duty. The suffering of individual daughters was framed as a necessary sacrifice for maintaining the divine nature of royalty. Religious festivals often coincided with the most egregious violations, as if the perpetrators sought divine sanction through timing. The New Year festival of Nowruz, celebrating renewal and purity, frequently saw multiple daughters summoned to the king's chambers. The Feast of Mithra, honoring the god of contracts and justice, became occasions for the king to renew his claims on his daughters. The blasphemy of these associations was apparent to outside observers, but invisible to those within the system. The religious education of royal daughters focused heavily on submission and sacrifice. They were taught that their highest spiritual achievement would be complete surrender to the king's will. Religious texts were selectively interpreted to emphasize female subservience and the divine nature of male authority. The girls were essentially programmed from childhood to see their abuse as a form of worship. Even death offered no escape from religious manipulation. Daughters who died as a result of abuse were declared martyrs who had achieved spiritual perfection through their suffering. Their names were inscribed in temple records as examples of proper devotion. This posthumous glorification of victims served to encourage living daughters to accept their fate, promising them eternal honor in exchange for earthly suffering. The system Xerxes perfected did not die with him. His assassination in 465 BCE might have offered hope for change, but his successors inherited both his throne and his practices. The institutionalized abuse of royal daughters continued through successive generations, each adding their own refinements to the machinery of exploitation. The trauma became embedded in the very structure of Persian royalty, passing from father to son like a cursed inheritance. Artaxerxes I, who succeeded Xerxes, had witnessed his father's treatment of his sisters throughout his childhood. Rather than being repelled by these practices, he'd been conditioned to see them as normal, even necessary for maintaining royal authority. Upon taking the throne, he claimed his father's women, including his half-sisters, as his own. The daughters who had hoped for liberation with Xerxes' death found themselves passed to a new abuser who knew their history and exploited their already broken spirits. The children born from these unions faced unique psychological challenges. They were products of incest, often knowing the circumstances of their conception, yet were raised to perpetuate the same system. Sons were taught that their sisters were future possessions, while daughters grew up knowing their fate was sealed from birth. The psychological damage was not individual but collective, affecting entire generations of the royal family. Succession struggles after Xerxes' death added another layer of horror for royal daughters. Different factions would claim daughters as proof of their legitimacy, using them as living symbols of their right to rule. Amydas, whom we discussed earlier, was claimed by 3 different princes during the succession crisis, each asserting their ownership through violation. The women became battlegrounds in wars they had no part in starting. The record-keeping of the Persian court, while sanitized, reveals patterns of early death among royal daughters. The average lifespan of a royal daughter was significantly shorter than that of other royal women. Suicide, though never explicitly recorded as such, can be inferred from many deaths. Sudden illness, falling accidents, and unfortunate mishaps appear with suspicious frequency in the records of daughters who had been frequently summoned to royal chambers. The mothers who survived to see their daughters suffer the same fate they had endured developed complex coping mechanisms. Some became actively complicit, convincing themselves that preparing their daughters well would minimize their suffering. Others retreated into madness, unable to reconcile their maternal instincts with their powerlessness. A few attempted to protect their daughters through political maneuvering, though success was rare and punishment severe. The impact extended beyond the immediate royal family. Noble families who received these damaged daughters as wives had to navigate the psychological aftermath. Children raised by traumatized mothers who could barely function created new cycles of dysfunction. The poison of the palace spread throughout the Persian nobility, creating a ruling class characterized by normalized abuse and emotional detachment. Historical records from the later Achaemenid period show attempts by some rulers to reform or at least moderate these practices. Darius II tried to limit the practice to symbolic ceremonies rather than actual violation, but faced resistance from court factions who saw any change as weakness. The system had become so entrenched that even kings who might have wished to end it found themselves constrained by tradition and expectation. The mechanisms of control employed in the Persian royal harem were sophisticated and multifaceted, designed to ensure complete compliance while maintaining the facade of divine order. Physical barriers were just the beginning. The true prison was constructed from psychological manipulation, social isolation, and systematic dehumanization. Every aspect of a royal daughter's existence was carefully controlled from the moment she showed signs of maturation. The architecture of the harem itself was a tool of control. The quarters where mature daughters were kept were designed to disorient and isolate. Windows were placed too high to see out, corridors twisted and turned to prevent any sense of location, and doors could only be opened from the outside. The physical environment constantly reinforced the message: you are trapped, you are powerless, resistance is futile. The eunuch guards, themselves victims of mutilation, formed a complex part of the control system. These men, castrated in youth to serve the palace, were both sympathetic to the women's plight and complicit in their abuse. They were the only male presence most daughters knew besides their father, creating a distorted view of masculinity. Some eunuchs showed kindness, others cruelty, but all were ultimately agents of the king's will. Food and water were carefully controlled, used as tools of reward and punishment. Daughters who showed resistance might find their meals reduced to bread and water, while those who displayed compliance received delicacies. The uncertainty of provision created a constant state of anxiety. Some daughters developed eating disorders, either refusing food as their only form of protest or overeating when food was available, unsure when the next meal would come. Sleep deprivation was systematically employed to break resistance. Daughters could be summoned at any hour, keeping them in a constant state of exhaustion and fear. The unpredictability of summons meant they could never fully rest. Many developed severe insomnia, afraid to sleep lest they be caught unprepared. This chronic exhaustion made resistance even more difficult and clouded their ability to think clearly. The use of drugs and intoxicants added another layer of control. Before being sent to the king's chambers, daughters were often given wine mixed with opiates to make them more compliant. These substances, presented as calming draughts or sacred preparations, left the girls disoriented and unable to fully remember or process what happened to them. Over time, some became dependent on these substances, adding addiction to their list of chains. Information control was absolute. Daughters were forbidden from learning to read or write beyond basic levels, preventing them from recording their experiences or communicating with the outside world. The fragments we have from Amidus, scratched into walls, were extraordinary exceptions. Most daughters lived and died without leaving any record of their thoughts, their suffering, or their resistance. Their voices were systematically silenced. The clothing system served as both identification and humiliation. Different colors and styles marked a daughter's status, whether she had been summoned yet, how frequently, whether she was currently in favor or disfavor. These visual markers ensured that everyone knew each woman's history at a glance, making privacy or dignity impossible. The clothes themselves were designed to be easily removed, adding to the sense of vulnerability and accessibility. Beyond the sexual abuse that formed the core of their suffering, royal daughters endured various forms of physical and psychological torture designed to ensure complete submission. These methods, refined over generations, were calculated to break the will without causing visible permanent damage that might reduce a daughter's value in future political marriages. The sophistication of these techniques reveals a systematic approach to human destruction that prefigures many modern understanding of torture's psychological impact. Sensory deprivation was frequently employed as punishment for any sign of resistance. Daughters could be placed in completely dark chambers for days or weeks, with food pushed through a slot. The isolation and darkness caused hallucinations, panic attacks, and sometimes permanent psychological damage. When finally released, many were so grateful for human contact that they would comply with anything to avoid being returned to the darkness. Water torture, though leaving no permanent marks, was another tool in the arsenal of control. Daughters might be subjected to near-drowning experiences, held underwater until the point of unconsciousness, then revived. This process, repeated multiple times, created a profound fear response that could be triggered by something as simple as the sound of running water. The psychological impact lasted long after the physical experience ended. Forced witnessing of punishment inflicted on others was a particularly cruel form of psychological torture. Daughters were made to watch as their servants, and sometimes their own mothers or sisters, were punished for real or imagined infractions. The message was clear: your compliance protects not just yourself, but those you care about. This created a web of traumatic responsibility that made resistance feel selfish and dangerous. Temperature extremes were used to break down physical and psychological resistance. Daughters might be locked in rooms that were either freezing cold or suffocatingly hot, their clothing removed to increase their discomfort. The inability to regulate their own body temperature created a sense of helplessness that extended beyond the immediate physical discomfort. Some developed permanent sensitivity to temperature changes as a result. Humiliation rituals were regularly conducted to destroy any remaining sense of self-worth. Daughters might be forced to perform degrading acts in front of court audiences, presented as entertainment for visiting dignitaries, or made to publicly declare their gratitude for the king's attention. These public humiliations served the dual purpose of breaking the individual victim and warning other daughters of the futility of resistance. The threat of mutilation, while rarely carried out, hung over every interaction. Daughters were reminded that beauty was their only value, and that the king could destroy that beauty at whim. Some were shown instruments of disfigurement, told detailed descriptions of what could be done to them. The fear of losing the only thing that might eventually secure them a marriage and escape from the palace was a powerful tool of control. Psychological manipulation extended to creating false hope and then destroying it. A daughter might be told she was to be married and freed, allowed to prepare and even meet her supposed future husband, only to have the arrangement cancelled at the last moment. This cycle of hope and despair was repeated until the victims learned to expect nothing, to hope for nothing, to exist in a state of perpetual resignation. One of the most tragic aspects of this system was how it corrupted maternal bonds and female solidarity. Mothers, themselves victims of the system, were forced into the role of preparing their daughters for the same fate. This forced complicity created a complex dynamic of guilt, resentment, and twisted love that destroyed the natural mother-daughter relationship. The system's genius lay in making its victims into its perpetrators. The older women in the harem, those who had survived decades in the system, formed a hierarchy of their own. Some became harsh enforcers, perhaps believing that preparing girls properly would minimize their suffering. Others retreated into silence, unable to participate, but powerless to prevent. A few tried to offer comfort and protection where they could, though always within the constraints of the system. The chief wife often held theoretical authority over the harem, but this power was illusory when it came to protecting royal daughters from the king. Some chief wives attempted to use their influence to moderate the king's behavior, but most learned that showing too much concern for the daughters could result in their own fall from favor. The system forced women to choose between their moral instincts and their survival. Competition among mothers for their daughters to receive favorable treatment created another layer of moral corruption. Some mothers actively promoted their daughters to the king, believing that being in favor was better than being ignored and forgotten in the harem. This competition destroyed potential alliances among the women and ensured that collective resistance never emerged. The servants and attendants, often slaves or women from conquered territories, occupied the lowest rung of the harem hierarchy. They witnessed everything but could say nothing. Some showed kindness to the royal daughters when possible, small acts of humanity in an inhuman system. Others, brutalized by their own treatment, took out their frustrations on the only people with less power than themselves. Female physicians and healers who treated the daughters faced impossible ethical dilemmas. They saw the physical evidence of abuse, treated the injuries, and sometimes saved the lives of girls who wished to die. Yet speaking out would mean their own death and change nothing. Their medical records, carefully worded to avoid explicit acknowledgement of abuse, nevertheless provide some of our only documentation of the physical toll of the system. The few women who attempted resistance faced consequences designed to serve as examples to others. One account describes a mother who tried to help her daughter escape. Both were caught, and the mother was forced to watch as her daughter was subjected to public punishment before being executed herself. Her other daughters were then made to attend their mother's execution, a clear message about the price of resistance. Yet even within this system of near-total control, small acts of resistance and solidarity occurred. Women developed coded languages to communicate, shared strategies for psychological survival, and sometimes managed to protect the youngest girls for a few precious months or years. These acts of courage, though they could not change the system, preserved some thread of humanity within the nightmare. The Greek historians who provide much of our documentation of Persian practices viewed them through their own cultural lens, mixing genuine horror with cultural prejudice and sometimes prurient fascination. Herodotus, writing about Persian customs, expressed shock at practices that violated Greek taboos about incest, yet his accounts also betray a certain voyeuristic interest in the exotic other. This complicated relationship with the source material requires careful analysis to separate fact from propaganda. The Babylonians, who had been conquered by Persia but retained their own cultural practices, left records suggesting their disgust with Persian royal customs. Cuneiform tablets discuss the arrival of Persian princesses in Babylonian noble houses with a mixture of honor at the alliance and horror at the women's condition. One tablet describes a Persian princess who had to be taught how to look people in the eye, so thoroughly had she been conditioned to submission. Egyptian sources, particularly from the period of Persian occupation, provide another perspective. The Egyptians, with their own complex but different approach to royal sexuality and power, found Persian practices particularly abhorrent. Egyptian priests recorded their refusal to perform blessing ceremonies for marriages they considered sacrilegious, leading to significant tension between Persian rulers and Egyptian religious authorities. The Indian kingdoms on the eastern edge of the Persian Empire provide yet another viewpoint. Sanskrit texts from this period describe Persian emissaries seeking marriages with Indian princesses and the careful negotiations to ensure Indian women would not be subjected to Persian harem practices. These negotiations reveal that the reputation of Persian treatment of royal women had spread far beyond the empire's borders. Trade relationships were sometimes affected by Persian practices. Merchants from various cultures who dealt with the Persian court reported their discomfort with what they witnessed or heard. Some trading partnerships were reportedly terminated when merchants learned their goods were being used to prepare royal daughters. The economic impact of moral revulsion, while hard to quantify, appears in various commercial records of the period. Military alliances were complicated by the Persian practice of offering royal daughters to seal agreements. Some potential allies refused these offerings, understanding the implications. Others accepted, but treated the women with a kindness that stood in stark contrast to their treatment in Persia. The accounts of Persian princesses finding unexpected gentleness in foreign courts provide some of the few moments of light in this dark history. The Scythians, often portrayed as barbarians by both Greeks and Persians, left archaeological evidence suggesting they were appalled by Persian practices. Burial sites show Scythian nobles married to Persian princesses treated these women with unusual honor, perhaps in deliberate contrast to their treatment in Persia. Some Scythian leaders reportedly refused Persian princesses altogether, considering them cursed by their treatment. The Jewish exile community in Babylon, and later those who returned to Jerusalem under Persian rule, provides another perspective. Their texts carefully navigate the reality of living under Persian authority while maintaining their own moral codes. The Book of Esther, while not explicitly addressing the treatment of royal daughters, hints at the dangerous dynamics of the Persian court and the vulnerability of women within it. The fall of the Achaemenid Empire to Alexander the Great in 330 BCE did not immediately end the systems of abuse established by Xerxes and his successors. Alexander, in his attempt to fuse Greek and Persian cultures, adopted many Persian court customs, though Greek sources suggest he was horrified by some practices he discovered in the Persian royal harem. The women he found there, damaged by generations of abuse, presented a humanitarian crisis that challenged his vision of cultural synthesis. The Seleucid Empire, which inherited much of Persian territory after Alexander's death, faced the question of what to do with Persian royal customs. Some Seleucid rulers attempted to maintain modified versions of the harem system, while others rejected it entirely. The gradual dissolution of the systematic abuse of royal daughters took generations, with pockets of the practice persisting in various forms throughout the Hellenistic period. The Parthian Empire, which arose from the ashes of Seleucid rule, showed a complex relationship with Achaemenid traditions. While claiming to be the heirs of ancient Persia, they modified many of the most extreme practices. The treatment of royal women improved somewhat, though the harem system itself persisted. The memory of Achaemenid excesses served as a cautionary tale, even as Parthian rulers struggled with their own versions of absolute power. The Sassanid Empire, the last pre-Islamic Persian empire, provides an interesting endpoint to this historical arc. Zoroastrianism experienced a revival under Sassanid rule, but with reformed interpretations that explicitly condemned the practices of the Achaemenid period. Sassanid religious texts describe the Achaemenid treatment of royal daughters as a corruption of true Zoroastrian values, though how much this represented genuine reform versus political distancing from the past remains debated. The Islamic conquest of Persia in the 7th century CE brought new perspectives on the historical treatment of women in Persian royal courts. Islamic historians writing about pre-Islamic Persia used the Achaemenid treatment of royal daughters as an example of the Jahiliyyah, the ignorance and barbarism that Islam came to replace. These accounts, while colored by religious bias, preserve details about Persian practices that might otherwise have been lost. The medieval Persian literary tradition, particularly the Shahnameh of Ferdowsi, largely sanitizes or omits the darker aspects of ancient Persian royal life. This selective memory reflects a cultural need to construct a noble past while acknowledging enough historical darkness to explain Persia's periods of decline. The transformation of historical trauma into mythological narrative shows how societies process collective shame. Modern Iranian historical consciousness struggles with this aspect of ancient Persian history. The Achaemenid Empire is celebrated for its achievements in administration, architecture, and tolerance of diverse cultures, while the treatment of royal women is often minimized or attributed solely to Greek propaganda. This selective engagement with history reflects the ongoing difficulty of confronting systematic historical trauma. The archaeological evidence continues to emerge, with recent excavations at Persepolis and other Persian sites revealing new details about harem life. Physical evidence of the architectural controls, the separation of spaces, and even personal items belonging to royal women provides material confirmation of practices described in textual sources. Each discovery adds another piece to our understanding of this systematic horror. The story of Xerxes and his treatment of royal daughters serves as one of history's darkest examples of how absolute power, religious manipulation, and systematic dehumanization can create horrors that persist across generations. It reminds us that the greatest atrocities often occur not in public spaces, but in private ones, hidden behind walls of privilege and power. The suffering of these women, erased from most historical narratives, demands recognition not for sensationalism, but for the lessons it teaches about power, abuse, and the human capacity for both cruelty and endurance. The systematic nature of the abuse reveals how institutions can normalize the unconscionable. What began perhaps as individual excess became codified practice, then religious doctrine, then unquestioned tradition. Each generation of perpetrators could point to precedent, to religious sanction, to political necessity. The machinery of abuse, once established, perpetuated itself with terrifying efficiency. The complicity required to maintain such a system extended far beyond the immediate perpetrators. It required the silence of witnesses, the cooperation of religious authorities, the acquiescence of mothers, and the participation of an entire court structure. This web of complicity shows how systematic evil requires not just evil individuals, but the corruption of entire social structures. The voices of the victims, largely silenced by history, speak to us through fragments, scratches on walls, medical records, the observations of outsiders. These fragments remind us that behind every historical atrocity are individual human beings who suffered, who resisted in whatever ways they could, who maintained their humanity despite systematic attempts to destroy it. Their courage in the face of hopeless circumstances deserves recognition and remembrance. The international reaction to Persian practices, varied as it was, shows that even in ancient times, there were recognized bounds of acceptable behavior that the Persian treatment of royal daughters exceeded. The universal human revulsion at these practices, across cultures and centuries, suggests that despite cultural relativism, some acts are recognized as fundamentally wrong by human moral intuition. The generational trauma inflicted by this system did not end with the fall of the Achaemenid Empire. Its echoes can be traced through successive Persian dynasties, through the treatment of women in various Middle Eastern royal courts, through the normalization of practices that should never have been normalized. Understanding this historical trauma is essential for comprehending the long-term impact of systematic abuse on cultures and societies. For modern audiences, this history serves as a warning about the dangers of unchecked power, the manipulation of religion for political ends, and the vulnerability of those without voice or agency. It reminds us that the veneer of civilization can hide profound barbarism, that architectural grandeur and cultural achievement can coexist with systematic horror, and that the most vulnerable members of society often suffer in silence while history celebrates their oppressors. As we close this examination of one of history's darkest chapters, we must remember that the story of these royal daughters is not merely ancient history. It is a reminder that power without accountability creates monsters, that religious authority can be twisted to justify any atrocity, and that the voices of victims must be heard and preserved, no matter how powerful their abusers. The daughters of Xerxes, silenced in their lifetime, speak to us across millennia, warning us that what happened in the palaces of ancient Persia can happen again wherever absolute power meets systematic dehumanization. Their suffering was worse than death because it was designed to be a calculated destruction of human dignity that served the purposes of power. In remembering them, in speaking their silenced truth, we honor not just their memory, but our commitment to never allow such systematic horror to be normalized again.